What do we owe to each other? In this video lecture, I'm going to be looking at T.M. Scanlon's Contractualism from his book, What We Owe to Each Other. Scanlon begins with three basic moral questions. First, when we claim an action is morally right or wrong, what kind of judgment are we making? Is it the kind of judgment we might say when we like some kind of a food, or we don't like that kind of a food? Is it the kind of judgment we make when we say to a friend maybe, I don't like it when you spend time with the other person, right, and you don't spend time with me? Or is it the kind of judgment we make when we are involved with math and we say that it is correct that 2 plus 2 equals 4 and it is incorrect that it equals 5? What are the differences between those kinds of judgments? Secondly, what kind of reasoning then do we engage in when we make this claim? Is it that kind of reasoning that's involved in mathematics? Is it a kind of reasoning that's involved, let's say, deductively then? Is it inductive reasoning? What are we doing when we engage in moral reasoning and when we say specifically an action is morally right or wrong? And the third question, why should we give considerations of right and wrong this kind of priority over our other concerns and over other values? So here he's assuming that we do give priority to moral judgments, that when someone says something is morally wrong, there's something perhaps more serious than, say, I don't like that breakfast you made, right? There's maybe a unseriousness involved in that, or maybe just a matter of distaste, right? But it seems like with moral reasoning, there's something different, the kind of moral values that we take to be important. We center our lives around moral values in a way that perhaps we don't with other kinds of values. And so why, though? Why? Now, Scanlon is going to turn to social contract theory in order to answer these questions. So social contract theory we can see coming from Hobbes originally, this idea that basically we come to a kind of an agreement to enter an association for some kind of a reason. In the case of Locke, it's developed a little bit more, where it's more of a hypothetical contract, and basically it's used in those political terms to justify governments, their legitimacy. So in the case of like Lockean social contract theory, we would say, although we have never explicitly agreed to consent to the government we live under, if we use reason, we would see hypothetically that it is actually better if it protects our natural rights of life, liberty, and property. It would be better to live under that government than not. So therefore, the government is justified because reason can tell us that if we ever were in that position, it would be the rational thing to do. Now, specifically, though, in the case of moral theory, social contract theory derives the content of morality from the notion of an agreement between all those in the moral domain. So it's very similar to the political social contract, but in this case, it's more normative. And the scope, perhaps, in this way is actually wider than just the political social contract theory, which is concerned with the legitimacy of a government. But even in that case, right, even though Scanlon is interested in social contract theory, he still wants to know, though, even in that kind of theorizing, what reasons and what forms of reasoning are justifiable? What is involved in social contract theory that would be justifiable? How do we know what kind of reasoning that is? How do we distinguish it from other kinds? Now, first, he thinks the answer is not a metaphysical question. It's not that we can just appeal to the nature of the good, such that when we know what the nature of the good is, then we can say, well, that's why we're justified in appealing to moral values. He thinks that when we judge something as being morally correct or wrong, those kind of judgments do not originate from metaphysical concerns. He says the point of such judgments, of moral judgments, is rather a practical one. They make claims about what we have reason to do. Metaphysical questions about the subject matter of judgments of right and wrong are important only if answers to them are required in order to show how these judgments can have this practical significance. So in the case of moral judgments, there's a kind of a matter about what we're doing and not what we're perhaps recognizing about the essence of something. There's a way as well where we can prioritize certain judgments over others in certain cases in a way that it might not make sense if we were appealing to metaphysical justification. So for Scanlon, judgments of right and wrong are claims about reasons. And he says more specifically about the adequacy of reasons for accepting or rejecting principles under certain conditions. So when we make moral judgments, we want to know, what is your reasoning for doing so? So why are you doing this? Perhaps what is your motivation? What's the kind of belief you have? Then we want to know, right, what is the condition? How does that relate to other people and the other kinds of reasons they might have? Now, he considers an objection from the person who wants to say, well, moral judgments originate from metaphysical concerns. He says, or the objection says, to say an act is wrong if and only if it could not be justified by others on grounds that they could not reasonably object to, is still to say this is because what can or cannot be reasonably objected to is determined by facts about what is right or wrong in a deeper sense that is independent of any idea of reasonable rejection. So the objection from the perspective of the person appealing to the metaphysical foundation of moral judgments is going to say, well, the reason people would say, yeah, it's about reasons is because good reasons are those which in some way correspond to the nature of good, and bad reasons are those which do not. Scanlon, though, responds to that by saying, my view denies this. It holds that thinking about right and wrong is, at the most basic level, thinking about what could be justified to others on grounds that they, if appropriately motivated, could not reasonably reject. In this way, then, what he's saying is that if moral judgments are concerned with reasons and the reasons persons have, in this way, then, it is thrown to others, and it's thrown to others in the way that they live, and the way that they can inhabit that reasoning and try to make sense of it. It takes into account motivation. It's not just about reasons, it's about motivation. In that sense, then, it's not merely about metaphysics, because it's about other concerns that go beyond whatever metaphysical truths there might or might not be. So he says, he's come up with the formula for how persons determine whether an action is morally permissible or not, right? What the basis of those moral judgments are. According to his contractualism, an act is wrong if and only if any principle that it permitted would be one that could reasonably be rejected by people moved to find principles for the general regulation of behaviors that others, similarly motivated, could not reasonably reject. So it's the case that if I do something and someone else is able to reject it, it can't just be the case that randomly they just say, I reject it, so therefore I can't do it. It's immoral. They have to have reasons. And they have to have reasons that if they were motivated in the same way to do whatever I'm going to do, then they would, in that position, see I don't have justification for doing what I'm doing. We can see here in the picture I have Chidi, actually, from the show The Good Place, which references the book by Scanlon, What We Owe to Each Other. A great show if you want a kind of popular approach to learning about ethics. Now, it seems perhaps that the kind of contractualism that Scanlon is offering is a kind of deontology. I mean, it just seems like, well, it's seeking reasons that can't be reasonably rejected. That's impartial. Contractualism is an impartial moral theory. It's not the case that, well, maybe in virtue ethics, certain kinds of virtue ethics, you might want to appeal to family members, and those take priority over, let's say, like strangers, what you should do. In this case, anybody can have a reasonable rejection. They can reasonably reject whatever you're going to do as long as they can be suitably motivated. So in this way, it's an impartial moral theory. It also seeks a free agreement between persons that elucidates freedom and equality, very similar to the third formulation of the categorical imperative by Kant, the kingdom of ends. That which is good is that which treats everyone as equals, such that they agree to act in a certain way that is equal with everyone else. So, isn't contractualism just deontology? Definitely, Scanlon is influenced by Kant, but there's a big difference that Scanlon points out. In the case of Kant's deontology, the normative morality stems from the conditions of our rational agency. So notice there's an appeal to rationality. In that case, what Kant means is that that action is moral, which is not influenced in any way by concerns outside the bounds of reason itself. So anything having to do with desire, emotions, outcomes, right? So consequences, any of those kinds of things, those would not lead to an autonomous will. That when you follow the categorical imperative for Kant, you are thinking about what is possible without contradiction logically. In that case, the will is autonomous, and that it is responsible for what it wills itself. It does not take into account other concerns outside of itself. But with Scanlon, that's not quite the case. With Scanlon's contractualism, the normativity, so the kind of force that says we ought to do something of morality, stems from the requirements of justifiability to others by showing how other aspects of our lives and our relations with others involves this idea. Which means any kind of interest, consequences, feelings, desires, etc., whatever it may be, those are fair game as long as they are reasonable. In this way, then, the will is heteronomous. It has to take into account things outside of merely itself. This is why Scanlon's contractualism is not simply a deontology. It's not concerned with just rightness itself that can be theorized outside of other concerns. The key question, then, is what is meant by reasonable rejection? So, to reasonably reject a principle, I must have some kind of an objection to it. Why can't I just appeal to rationality, right? Why say it's a reasonable rejection and not a rational objection? Why can't I just say as well that, well, if it's a rational objection, I can just say you shouldn't do X because it is irrational. And in that way, I don't really have to appeal to particular persons. I don't have to appeal to what anyone might do or could do. I just can use reason itself to determine what actions a priori are justified and what are not. But Scanlon says that reasonableness is different from rationality because it appeals to motivation. So he has this interesting case here. I'll read from pages 192 to 193. He says, so the distinction between what it would be reasonable to do in this sense and what it would be rational to do is not a technical one, but a familiar distinction in ordinary language. Suppose, for example, that we are negotiating about water rights in our country and that there is one landowner who already controls most of the water in the vicinity. Okay, so you have one person who controls most of the water. They have a right to it for some reason. This person has no need for our cooperation. He can do as he pleases, and what he chooses to do will largely determine the outcome of the negotiations. Suppose also that while he is not ungenerous, so he would probably provide water from his own wells for anyone who desperately needed it, he is extremely irritable and does not like to have the legitimacy of his position questioned. So it's not the case that he's like a Scrooge, he doesn't care about others. He does, but he doesn't like, to feel like he doesn't know what's best, okay? In such a situation, it would not be unreasonable for one of us to maintain that each person is entitled to at least a minimum supply of water and to reject any principle of allocation which does not guarantee this, because we, of course, don't want to irritate him such that he would not give us water, right? Because he basically owns most of the water, and in this way, then, if we irritate him, he can then decide not to give us water. So it makes sense that we just give in to his demands. It's rational to do so, because otherwise we risk not getting any water at all. But this might not be rational to make this claim or to reject such principles, since this is very likely to enrage the large landowner and lead to an outcome that is worse for almost everyone. Moreover, it is natural to say that it would be unreasonable of the large landowner to reject our request for principles guaranteeing minimum water rights. What it would be rational for him to do, in the most common understanding of that term, is a different question, and it depends on what his aims are. There is, then, a familiar distinction between reasonableness and rationality. It might be objected that in calling attention to this distinction, I have concentrated exclusively on what would be rational simpliciter, and have not considered what would be rational given the particular aim I have specified. Why not, it might be asked, take rightness to be determined by the principles no one could rationally reject, given the aim of finding principles which others, who share the same, could not rationally reject? Basically, he says, because in more common situations, we must choose among principles, each of which would benefit some at the expense of others. In such cases, there may be no determinate answer in the abstract, so devoid of the particular situation which people find themselves in. To the question whether a given principle is or is not one that no one with the aim in question could rationally reject. And that's a point that, maybe if we look at the categorical imperative, it does abstract away from particular situations, right? Which is why it's not a hypothetical imperative. It doesn't say, if I am in this situation, the categorical imperative, right? It doesn't say, if I'm in this situation, should I do X, right? Or if I want X in this situation, then I should do such and such. But in other situations, I shouldn't do it if I don't want something else, right? Because that's a hypothetical. That's not something that can be universalized. That's why, in this way, Scanlon is appealing to reasonableness as opposed to rationality. Because with reasonableness, we look at the particular situations. Who are those people in that particular case that might need some water? As where in another case where someone might hold more water rights, it might not be reasonable because we have to take into account the particular circumstances of the situation. And if we appeal to reasonableness in this way, then we ask the person who has the water, right? If you were in the position of someone else, right, the other people who depend on you for water, right, what would be the reasonable principle upon which how water should be distributed? Because you have a certain way that you should approach the situation, taking into account their concerns. And so they could reject the person who owns most of the water from keeping the water for themselves on the basis that if they were in their shoes, so if they were similarly motivated from their point of view, it would not make sense for that person to decide for themselves who gets water. So this is why he does not speak of rationality, he does not appeal to it with the contractualist formula, but instead appeals to reasonableness. Secondly, again, to reasonably reject a principle, I must have some objection to it. But why isn't the negative impact of an action on me sufficient? Why can't I just say it makes me sad? Why can't I just say, well, if you do X, I'm not going to be able to make as much money, right? So maybe if you pursue that job that I really want, you're more qualified, and that means I'm not going to be able to get the job, so it has a negative impact on me, so you shouldn't go for that job that I want, right? Why can't I just appeal to the negative impact it has on me? In this way, it seems like almost there's almost a subjectivist approach here in the sense of whether someone can reasonably reject a principle or not. But Scanlon does not think we can just appeal to the negative impact of an action on me, right? That's not sufficient in itself. He says, to know whether I can reasonably reject the principle, I must ask how it impacts on others. So, according to contractualism, in order to decide whether it would be wrong to do X in circumstances C, we should consider possible principles governing how one may act in such situations, and ask whether any principle that permitted one to do X in those circumstances could, for that reason, reasonably be rejected. So, in order to determine whether a principle can be reasonably rejected, I have to consider a number of standpoints outside of my own. So I can't just appeal to the negative impact it has on me. In some cases, the negative impact it has on me might be enough, but it depends only if I take into account the positions of others. So I have to view that action from the point of view of its main beneficiaries. So who does it primarily affect? Not just me, but others as well. And from the point of view of those who will be constrained by it or those who would be benefited from an alternative principle. So I can't just say, well, I'm negatively affected by you getting that job because you're going to get it and I won't get it. I also have to take into account, what does that person gain by getting that job? Is it something that I, given more time, could not be a better candidate for that job? What about if there's another principle that regulates how people get jobs that would be better, right? To determine whether it's reasonable for that person to, apply for that job on that basis or not, just given that example. So this is not a kind of egoist or subjectivist kind of basis for whether or not someone can reject a principle, right? I have to appeal to the impact it has on others. But in some cases, right, let's say it just happens that the majority of people decide that they don't like me living in the apartment complex, so they're going to kick me out of the apartment complex, right? Well, it seems like taking the standpoint of others, then we can say that they win and that it's moral for them to kick me out of the apartment complex. But we have to look at, okay, what about me, right? What about from my standpoint? If there's no reason, if I haven't violated something, if I haven't violated a policy, then even though they might reject me living in the apartment complex, they don't have a reasonable case, they don't have a reasonable objection, because if they were in my shoes, if they considered what they want to do from my standpoint, they would see they would not agree with it. And if they would not agree with it, all it takes is one reasonable rejection. That's it. So there's this kind of search for unanimity according to reasonableness. So sometimes the negative impact on me is sufficient, but it's not always sufficient prima facie or inherently. Third way to understand reasonable rejection. So again, to reasonably reject a principle, I must have some objection to it. Why isn't there a generic reason we can appeal to, like well-being? I mean, utilitarians or other kinds of consequentialists, they can just appeal to well-being and say, yeah, of course, the reason, whether someone can reject something reasonably has to do with whether their well-being is diminished when compared to the well-being of everyone else, right? But Scanlon says, we have reason to object to principles simply because they arbitrarily favor the claims of some over the identical claims of others. Or in other words, we have reason to object to principles because they are unfair, not just because they benefit the well-being of everyone overall. So he says, it seems to me an important strength of contractualism is that, in contrast to utilitarianism, which says to maximize the greatest pleasure or happiness for the greatest number of people, and other views which make well-being the only fundamental moral notion, contractualism can account for the significance of different moral notions beyond well-being within a unified moral framework without reducing all of them to a single idea. So contractualism is not in favor of moral aggregation. It doesn't say actually all other kinds of values are really subsumed by one, which is well-being, or it doesn't say that it doesn't matter if one person is hurt by an action as long as the majority benefit, because what contractualism says is that if those people that benefit put themselves on the standpoint of the person that is not benefiting from that action, and they realize there's no real basis why those people should benefit, maybe it's just a lottery, randomly some people are chosen and others are negatively affected, then that person can appeal to it and say it's unfair because there's no reason why you get to benefit while I hurt. Even if I'm in the minority, right, only a few people hurt. Contractualism can say that there's a reasonable rejection in that case based on unfairness. But to what extent can contractualism avoid moral aggregation? So there's this case from the philosopher John Turek, known as the rocks. So say 6 innocent swimmers have become trapped on 2 rocks by the incoming tide. 5 of the swimmers are on one rock, while the last swimmer is on the second rock. Each swimmer will drown unless they are rescued. You are the sole lifeguard on duty. You have time to get to one rock in your patrol boat and save everyone on it. Because of the distance between the rocks and the speed of the tide, you cannot get to both rocks in time. So what should you do? Now, a utilitarian is simply going to say, well, of course, you should get to the 5 swimmers as opposed to the one swimmer, because then you're going to save 5 people over 1. Now, that is a moral value that contractualism can appeal to. The problem is it's not the only moral value. And if there's another moral value that can be used to reasonably reject the boat coming to save the one person over the 5, then it would be enough, right? It would be justified. So there's an issue about this. How do you decide this case? Because clearly the 5 swimmers are going to say, hey, we're 5 lives over here, so it seems like you should clearly come and save us, right? So that's what they're going to appeal to, is well-being. Whereas the single person who's stuck is going to say, no, it's not fair that you go and save the 5 because you are taking advantage of my life, right? You're treating me as a kind of mere means to saving other people for some other reason. So what should be done? Should it be a coin toss, right? In this case, if there are competing moral values, well, again, there's no moral aggregation. You can't just say one moral value always wins out. So what do you do? Well, if there's 2 competing moral values where each has a reasonable claim, then perhaps some contractualists say you have to, flip a coin. But, is that fair to the 5 swimmers? Because they would say, hold on, you're flipping a coin. If it were just 2 people, perhaps you could flip a coin because the lives to be saved are equal. But if you just flip a coin, well, then you're saying 5 lives are worth the same as 1 life. Is that fair? Well, then maybe they can appeal and say they can reasonably reject that for that reason. Some other contractualists want to say, well, there's got to be some way, there's got to be some value we can appeal to such that contractualism can capture the moral intuition that says we should save the 5. But can it actually do that? Right? This is a question we'll have to leave open-ended and to think about. How does contractualism deal with these kinds of situations? The last consideration. So again, to reasonably reject a principle, I must have some objection to it. Can I object for impersonal reasons? So all the kinds of reasons we've considered are personal reasons, right? We're looking at specific individuals. But what about impersonal reasons? So Scanlon says, it might seem that impersonal reasons for rejection must be allowed, at least in principle. For it does not seem that all the reasons we have are grounded in the moral claims or the well-being of individuals, either ourselves or others. Many people, for example, believe that we have reason not to flood the Grand Canyon, or to destroy the rainforests, or to act in a way that threatens the survival of a species, our own or some other, simply because these things are valuable and ought to be preserved and respected, and not just because acting in these ways would be contrary to the claims or interests of individuals. Right? It seems like we could just say, even if nobody were to be hurt by, let's say, damming up the Grand Canyon and then mining it and kind of getting, destroying it, right? Let's say, for whatever reason, nobody's going to actually be hurt by it. Can we just appeal to the fact that the Grand Canyon is something, that should be respected in its own right, even though it's not a person? Why can't we appeal to those kind of reasons? Or to animals as well? Why can't we just appeal to the fact that we should save a species of animals, even if no one is going to be directly or indirectly impacted by, let's say, if that species were entirely wiped off the face of the earth, it wouldn't have an impact on anyone at all. Why can't we appeal to those kinds of reasons, these impersonal reasons, where we just say it's just a good for its own sake? Well, according to Scanlon, contractualism describes only one domain of moral ideas. Contractualism is only concerned with the requirements of what we owe to each other. So, he says reasons for rejecting a principle thus corresponds to particular forms of concerns that we owe to other individuals and not impersonally. That any time we apply the contractualist formula, it's always to particular individuals. It is never to some abstract notion. It is never impersonal reasons we consider because we only consider what do I owe to another human being. So, in this way, he's not saying that this is the only kind of moral consideration we can have. He's just saying contractualism is only concerned with what we owe to other human beings. And for this reason, by definition, there cannot be impersonal reasons that contractualism can consider. I think a good question to have then is that so contractualism is a theory that is meant to explain moral rightness and wrongness as it concerns individuals, right? Scanlon was particularly interested in those three questions that we began with. Therefore, as a moral theory, it does not pertain to animals, for example. Is this a defect? Is it wrong that a moral theory is constrained in this way? Right? Is it what we want from a moral theory? Do we want a moral theory that's better to take into account other kinds of moral interests? Do we want a moral theory that is able to not just be concerned human beings, but how we relate to other sentient beings as well? Or do we think it's acceptable that we can say, well, we have one kind of moral theory that solely, concerns relations between human beings, and then we can have other moral theories that concern maybe animals and other impersonal concerns. But we also might want to ask, well, if we say we might want to have different kinds of moral theories for different kinds of issues, are they all compatible? Are they coherent? Do they cohere with one another? Is it possible for contractualism, which says, well, it's only concerned with the kind of reasons other human beings can offer, how do you say that it can be coherent with concerns about animals as well? I mean, how, even if you say contractualism is just concerned with one area of moral theory, how do you make it cohere with other moral theories? This is a question we have to think about.